Hello and welcome. My name is Alan Dunn. I am the president of GDI Consulting and Training Company and the founder of the Manufacturing Executive Institute. I am also your instructor in this GDI Talent Acquisition Speed-E-Lesson. The purpose of these short lessons is to efficiently provide you with information that can help you to do a better job at talent sourcing, interviewing, hiring, and onboarding. In this lesson, I will talk about the changing talent acquisition landscape. This particular Speed-E lesson is the first in a series of lessons that are brought to you by GDI's Talent Acquisition Practice and produced by Radio MEI. I encourage you to check back periodically for newly uploaded Speed-E lessons. To learn more about how GDI's Talent Acquisition Practice can help your company find the right talent the first time, go to www.gditalent.com. Let's get started. In 2009 and 2010, our company conducted a significant research project that talked to over 600 CEOs and more than 2,900 of their direct reports. The purpose of the project was to explore why managers and leaders in manufacturing and distribution companies lose their jobs. Many studies have been done that look at the progression of people in their jobs, from beginning to success to promotions, etc. We were curious about why so many of our clients over the last several years have hired individuals with great applause only to find that those individuals are no longer in that company 1 to 2 years later. We were curious as to what has happened. Our research project resulted in 5 critical discoveries. The first discovery was that hiring practices are generally executed poorly in most manufacturing and distribution companies. And by most, I mean the substantial majority of manufacturing and distribution companies have very poor hiring practices. Our second discovery took a look at why candidates are distrustful of corporate hiring practices. Indeed, we discovered that they are actually distrustful of corporate hiring practices, and most candidates view most recruiting activities as a low-dignity process. We've all been there. We've all had that happen to us. We've all have interviewed for jobs, and we've all felt like we weren't treated fairly in many of our interviewing activities. Our third discovery was that too much emphasis is being placed on instinct in the final candidate selection process. Emotion and instincts tend to overwhelm the facts. This is usually a result of bad interviewing techniques or bad interviewing processes, and the final selection is made based on how people feel rather than the facts around the candidate. The fourth discovery really had 2 significant improvements that were identified. We discovered that 2 significant improvements desperately needed, in fact, in the talent acquisition world. One is we need to better define the jobs that we're hiring for, and then the second, we need to radically rethink our interviewing methods. And our fifth discovery was the most interesting of all. We discovered that advanced interviewing techniques in manufacturing and distribution companies actually create a sustainable competitive advantage. We actually have data to support this. We actually discovered that companies that follow a comparative structured interviewing process, which we'll talk about in future Speed-E lessons, actually end up hiring better people that last longer and are retained for a much longer period of time. This is a sustainable competitive advantage in any company. Now, as we go forward, I warn you that some solutions and recommendations from this Speed-E lesson and subsequent Speed-E lessons may cause you to feel uncomfortable. This is because so much of what we're going to talk about, particularly in interviewing, is going to be radically different from the way it's done now. We are going to propose that you completely rethink the interviewing process. Now, much has changed in the talent acquisition world. The 2 biggest changes are the advantages of social media and the advantages of mobile computing. Everybody is connected today, and everybody's not just connected at their desk, they're connected wherever they are as a result of both mobile and social media combined. But we want to spend some time here talking about 6 significant ways in which recruiting actually has changed in addition to this. The first way that recruiting or talent acquisition has changed that was defined by our study was we took a look historically at the recruiting processes and saw a huge focus on efficiency of the process. This is now replaced or being replaced by focusing on candidate outcomes. So we're becoming less concerned about the efficiency of the process and more focused on candidate outcomes simply because of the expense of a poor hire. We also discovered that historically we've tended to emphasize the sourcing element of talent acquisition. Before boards like Monster and JobVite and Indeed and ZipRecruiters and LinkedIn and Facebook and other sort of media, it was harder to find candidates. It was harder to find people who knew people who knew people. And so there was a lot of emphasis on how to find people. Now the focus is not on how to find people. That's actually the easiest part of recruiting now. Now we focus obsessively on factual candidate evaluation. Historically, we've made hiring decisions with little comparative candidate data. We used a lot of instinct and a lot of assumptions. Now we emphasize the development of comparative candidate data. You can see in the radar graph on the top of the screen, we have 4 candidates, John, Heather, George, and Carol. And we've been able to identify their strengths and weaknesses around these 18 characteristics, starting with job competencies, going around clockwise and ending with self-confidence. And we've been able to evaluate these individuals factually, and we've been able to depict how they compare to one another. And so you can see who has strengths and who has perhaps some weaknesses. We need to now emphasize the development of candidate data, and that data needs to be comparative in nature. Historically, we've also depended on instincts to make hiring's important decisions. We've actually used phrases, and you heard phrases like, I'm a fan of that candidate, or I like the way that candidate came across. Now we heavily rely again on data in the final selection process. So here we can see Heather. We've compared Heather against a baseline of all other jobs similar to the one we're interviewing here, and then also to the job description, which in our case, in our model, we call that a superior talent competency model. And so we now have the ability not only to compare Heather to other top candidates, but we also have the ability to compare Heather factually against a baseline and also against the company's requirements. Historically, there's been little formal interview training offered to hiring personnel, both in HR and the hiring manager, the supervisor or the boss of the person being hired. Today, we now depend on robust interview training for HR professionals and hiring managers. Indeed, one of the big differentiators we saw in high-performing companies is that they actually provided substantial interview training both to HR individuals as well as to hiring managers. That was a clear distinction between average performing and extraordinary performing companies. And then finally, historically, we've seen the hiring decisions made and they rarely exclude or even accounted for the interviewer's biases or potential biases. Today, we actively focus on reducing and eliminating interviewer biases, and this is easier because, again, we're moving towards fact-based interviews instead of instinct-based interviews. So the question is, what has not changed in the talent acquisition practice? If all that changed, what stays the same? Well, interestingly enough, the 8-step talent acquisition model still works and works extremely well. We first define job requirements. We then go and find the candidates, source them. We then screen them down so we have a reasonable number that we can then evaluate or interview. And then we profile those candidates. Profile means that we do reference checks, background checks, credential checks, etc., put a dossier together, and then eventually we select a candidate, final candidate. We engage that candidate with a job offer, and then we build some sort of onboarding process. Most companies do that fairly poorly, but at least everybody's trying. And then a year, 2 years after the person's hired, then we find a way to evaluate their performance. In today's Speedy lesson and in about the next 4 or 5 Speedy lessons, we're going to really focus heavily on how to define job requirements better and how to evaluate candidates better, how to actually conduct interviews better. I can hardly wait to get to the interviewing Speedy lesson because this is where the real money is made. This is where we really differentiate ourselves from the average companies. In 2012 and 2014, we updated the study and we found 5 more discoveries, or developed 5 more discoveries. The first one was really just an extension of one of the first discoveries. We discovered a few years later that a majority of manufacturing and distribution companies were still making a number of poor hiring decisions. They still hadn't received the message that hiring based on instinct, hiring without a plan, hiring without comparative data doesn't work any longer. But we did develop a very interesting discovery out of these updates, and this one in particular. We discovered that most hiring executives lack a usable framework for interviewing and comparing qualified candidates, but more importantly, they understand that they lack a usable framework, and they're mostly screaming for it. Of all the direct reports to those 602 executives we talked to, the vast majority of them wanted some form of usable framework that would really help them to compare candidates in the final pass of interviews. We also discovered that hiring itself is an important core business process that has to be executed excellently. In other words, hiring needs to be a core competency, not just in a few companies, but in every company. We have to now hire better. We now have to think about hiring as a core competency. We have to think about it not as a checkbox sort of approach, but as a real competency that we need to focus on heavily. We also discovered, interestingly enough, that which makes an employee an excellent performer is surprisingly not what you think. And this is a little bit of a tease, and I admit it. But I will tell you that it turns out it's not experience, and it's not education, and it's actually not intelligence. We discovered in our research that those three elements, those three characteristics, are not the largest determinant of success. They are not what moves someone from an average performance to extraordinary performance. But I'm going to let you hang for a few speedy lessons before we actually reveal the very specific characteristics that really change people's behavior and change their performance output. And finally, we discovered that technical skills are incredibly important in every job. Technical competency, or what we refer to as job competency, it turns out is one of the biggest reasons that people fail. But while it's one of the biggest reasons they fail, being technically competent isn't the largest reason behind being successful. Technical skills, while critically important, turn out to be not enough to foster extraordinary performance in any individual. And again, I'm teasing you a little bit. We're going to talk about what those other competencies and personal qualities are in a future Speedy lesson. The future is really bright for talent acquisition. There's a lot of good things happening. The most important difference in talent acquisition today from just as recently as 5 years ago is that the new paradigm of competing for top talent being as important as competing for customers is actually resonating in boardrooms and C-suites across the globe. I can't express how important this is. The executives are now starting to understand that this hiring process, this recruiting and talent acquisition process, as a core competency is what sets us up for success, or in some cases, for failure. The future is bright also because new sourcing, screening, and interviewing methodologies that can help to identify the best candidates have been developed or continue to be developed and are available to every company. There's also new opportunities for executing background reference and credential verifications that didn't exist in the pre-internet days. So we now have the ability to do background checks and reference and credential verifications better than we ever could do them in the past. And then there's so many new approaches to negotiating win-win agreements with new employees, and even methods for improving onboarding that are starting to again resonate in HR functions and C-suites and even boards of directors. So these are good. This is good news, and this is looking really good for most manufacturing and distribution companies. Now, at the end of each Speedy lesson, I try to provide a final thought. And that final thought in this particular Speedy lesson is that poor recruiting, it has a price, a really big price. That price is found in terms, or manifests in terms of lost compensation. So we have a poor employee, that employee doesn't work out, but that time that they were with us, we paid them, and that compensation is lost. We didn't get any value out of it. A lot of lost training time and expense, lost improvement time on initiatives that they might have been working on. And this is oftentimes about 9 to 12 months. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. What's below the surface is just immense. So But 9 to 12 months just to discover that the person hasn't worked out, and then you have to recruit and replace somebody, put somebody else in that position. You have to onboard that person. You have to retrain that person and incur all those expenses. The new person's likely going to make some of the same mistakes, so you get to revisit those a couple times. You may lose some momentum on some of the initiatives that were started. Then you might have some deterioration of morale, oftentimes when we hire the wrong person, or we refer to it as hiring misfits. We end up with a morale problem, and even sometimes a loss of reputation if this individual that you had to let go had a market-facing or a customer-facing role. We're talking 9 to 12 months to get somebody back up to speed. So I want you to think about this. We're talking about 1.5 to 2 years of lost momentum. Think about that. 1.5 to 2 years of lost momentum, improvement of your organization. You do that too many times, there's no sustainable competitive advantage in it for you. So we have to hire right the first time. Now, I also like to remind people at the end of each of these Speed-E lessons this following thought. And you're probably going to hear this in a lot of future Speed-E lessons, because sometimes there's educational elements that they're just worth repeating. So here's today's item to remember. Hiring top performers is serious business for serious people. Failing to allocate time and resources to this important leadership responsibility is a failure of the highest order. Let me read that last paragraph one more time. Failing to allocate time, money, and resources to this important leadership responsibility is a failure of the highest order. We can't allow that to happen. We can't fail our companies as a result of hiring poor people. We can't fail as a result of not putting the time into it. We can't fail because we didn't take talent acquisition seriously. My name is Alan Dunn. I'm president of GDI Consulting and Training Company, and I thank you for attending. Bye-bye now. This Speed-E lesson has been brought to you by GDI's Talent Acquisition Practice, a business unit of GDI Consulting and Training Company. Using proven assessment and evaluation processes, GDI's Talent Acquisition Practice specializes in matching the best candidates to each position the GDI is engaged to fill. With more than 37 years of relationships with high-performing manufacturing and distribution industry professionals, GDI brings unparalleled capabilities to fill almost any management, leadership, and technical position. Our clients value our deep industry expertise, our valuable insights, our rigorous candidate evaluation methodologies, and our dignity-centric commitment to the success of both clients and candidates. For more information about GDI's talent acquisition practice, visit us at www.gditalent.com.